Is done. Thank you.
Resuming debate, the reprise de débat, the honourable member from Kenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I'll be sharing my time with the member from Vaudreuil-Soulanges. I think that's right. I want to take this opportunity, as this is my first speech in the House in 12 years. I was the Member of Parliament for Kenora-Rainy River from 1988 to 2004. So for some 16 plus years, I had the great privilege of sitting in the House on both sides through the first term of my mandate as the Member of Parliament when Brian Mulroney was in power, and then, of course, under the Chrétien government. So, Madam Speaker, this is a great honour for me to have the chance to stand here in this place again, which is a great honour for those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about the business of the nation. So I want to say thank you for this opportunity to speak. Before I get into the remarks about the speech from the throne, Madam Speaker, I just want to say to people in the Kenora riding, thank you for their support. The Kenora riding, of course, as you know, historically has been a very tight race between three parties, sometimes just two, but in this election it was no different. The ex-Minister of Natural Resources under the previous government and the NDP leader of the NDP and I went at it for some number of weeks. I think it was 11. And so that was an interesting campaign in that we got a good chance to talk about the issues in the North. So before I talk about the North, I want to first of all thank my family, my wife Lana, for letting me do this again. This is a great place to work if you believe in improving the lives of the region that you come from. And I know you can't do it without your family. When I first came here in 1988, Madam Speaker, I had no children. Left with two children, one 10 and one 6, and now they're grown up. And very proud of both Samantha and Daniel, who had a big part in my campaign. Madam Speaker, I'm here because I belong to a particular party, but I am here also because I'm a northerner and a rural Canadian. And in this place, sometimes, as you might know, we spend a lot of time talking about issues that are more urban than rural, because it's a fact of life that there are way more urban Canadians than there are rural Canadians. So I'm here representing the views of northerners and some of the unique issues that we face. And I'm also here to say to you that I don't think I would have ran in this campaign if it wasn't for a leader in a party that had put forward an agenda of real change. Because real change has to take place every so often in this country, every so many generations, because people insist that those changes take place. And so I want to thank the Leader and the Prime Minister of Canada for giving me the opportunity to be here to talk about real change. Now, Madam Speaker, in the last campaign, over 70% of people in our region voted for change. That means they were not happy with the present member, or they weren't happy with the present government, and they certainly weren't happy with the direction that we were going in. So here we are at the very beginning of a new mandate with a new government, talking about real change. And so, if you're a member of Parliament in your first tour of duty and you're just starting out, I strongly recommend that we go out and ask our constituents what they mean by real change. So you just can't assume that everybody has the same view. So for the last number of months since I got elected, I've been out there talking to people, mayors, councillors, all different organizations, whether they be healthcare, education, obviously First Nations, what they expect from this government. And I want to say, Madam Speaker, that what's most interesting about what you're hearing from people is that they want a government that is active, that cares, that wants to do things, that believes you can make real change. In a region like mine, Madam Speaker, where you see the lack of infrastructure, the lack of development, a part of the world where 42 First Nations live, where over 20 of those First Nations still don't have roads, still are looking for a basic piece of infrastructure that most Canadians take for granted. And then you wonder in this place, and we talk about this on a regular basis, why First Nation people struggle. It's pretty simple. If you can't get to someone's home, as simple as their driveway, on a day-to-day basis, it's very difficult to build an economy. It's very difficult to build sewer and water. It's very difficult to build infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, I want to remind my colleagues not to forget the importance of regions like Northern Ontario, where we're still basically struggling to get that kind of infrastructure in place. So when the Prime Minister and the party and in the platform talk about major infrastructure development, you have to understand how important that is to those First Nations and the North. You have to understand the importance of what we're trying to achieve in the North when we talk about basic infrastructure. So why did I run, Madam Speaker, again? Because I think Northern Ontario, under the previous government, is falling further and further behind. Further behind in the fact that all the First Nations in the region had their capital funding cut. All First Nations in the region had their PTO cut. So that's the provincial territorial organizations that organize all the work that these communities do. When you know that that's happening, then you say to the party opposite that that's not going to hold for very long because communities need to grow. So, Madam Speaker, I ran on real change. I ran on the frustration because of a particular view that I think all Canadians share, that the basic principle of governing is that we look after our elderly, we look after our children, and we make decisions that are best for our country in the long term. So, Madam Speaker, when I went and talked to veterans in my region who were angry at the government for making major cuts and making their lives so difficult that they couldn't take it anymore and had to start going out and talking about demonstrating and doing the things they were doing, I knew that we were in trouble as a nation. When we started cutting things like the experimental lakes, one of the most successful research facilities in the world, in my region, and was cut by that government of the day, which saved them a total of $1.5 million, and embarrassed us all around the world because scientists could not figure out how anyone in their right mind would do something like that to a facility that was making such a difference to our environment. And then, Madam Speaker, when we look at things like health care, and one of the things that the previous Prime Minister making the decision of having an 11-week campaign did for me, it gave me, Madam Speaker, the opportunity to go door to door for a very long time and talk to a lot of people. And the number one issue for many people in regions like mine is health care and the issues of health care and how we're going to deal with seniors and how we're going to deal with elders and what we're going to do on home care. Those are the kinds of things that we are going to deal here in this place. Madam Speaker, in the short time that I have left, I just want you to know that this government, like any other government that runs on major real change, is not going to do it in the first 100 days. It's not going to do it in the first term. It takes a decade to make the kind of change that we are promoting here on this side of the House. And I think, like everyone else on this side, the platform that we ran in was the right one. But we have to take our time, get it right, make sure that we put in place those long-term changes that will improve the lives of this generation and the next generation to come. So, Madam Speaker, I'm honored to be in this House. Now, I've sat in almost every position that you can think of, except yours. I guess I just don't fit that criteria. But I've been a minister, I've been a parliamentary secretary, I've been a committee chair. All the things that I've done in this House have taught me one thing. If we work together and we forget that we just remind ourselves that the election is over and now it's time to govern, we'll make some very good decisions for the people we represent. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? L'honorable député de...
The Honourable Member for London Fanshawe.
Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague across the way. I did take note of the fact that he mentioned on numerous occasions that he was a member of the previous Liberal government, and then spoke about the need to support our First Nations communities. I would like to ask a question based on the fact that it was that previous Liberal government who imposed a debilitating 2% cap on First Nations spending. And of course, it was followed by further cuts by the government that has now been replaced. My concern is that we've seen promises in regard to an immediate inquiry into the cases of missing and murdered Indigenous women, a promise around funding education for First Nations communities, equitable funding for child and family services. I need absolute reassurance from this member that this promise, that these promises, that this commitment is going to be fulfilled. And I base that concern on the experiences of the past.
The honourable member from Kenora.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Speaker. The question is a good one. The question is always from the opposition. Are you going to meet your commitments that you made during the campaign? And it's pretty obvious. If you don't, then eventually you get defeated and you go and sit on the other side. So I could say, for the sake of argument here this afternoon, that when we were in government last time, we did, in fact, put a 2% cap on First Nation amount of their budget on a yearly basis. But in fairness to the people that were there then, when we took over from our friend Brian Mulroney, I was there, and most people in this House weren't there. We inherited a $42 billion deficits that had been run for a whole decade, and an economy that was in complete collapse, almost as bad as today, what we've inherited. So I say to the people opposite, be careful that you don't overemphasize the fact that we've, haven't made all our commitments happen all in 100 days. Because circumstances dictate how you operate as a government, and so, yes, I expect that we will fulfill our commitments. How and when will depend on the financial situation that we're in, Madam Speaker. And just to remind everyone, when Brian Mulroney was in power, he made those commitments, but never fulfilled them, and we had to turn around and clean up that mess. Thank you.
Questions and comments. Questions et commentaires. The honourable member. From Dufferin County? Dufferin County.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Question for the member from Kenora. One of the major platforms of the government is to have great amounts of infrastructure funding, and he referred to some of it in his comments to the House this afternoon. And of course, everyone in this House, we all represent different types of ridings. We represent big cities, small towns, rural communities, areas for Indigenous peoples. My question is, with the amount of money that's being planned to be spent by the government on infrastructure, is he aware of the strategy that the government will be imposing as to which communities get what and when?
Honourable member from Kenora.
Well, Madam Speaker, I'll just say this to the member. I come from a region that still is waiting for its Trans-Canada Highway to be twinned. So I hope that part of our strategy is start twinning the highway in Northern Ontario so we can have a twinned highway like most other Canadians from coast to coast to coast. I hope, Madam Speaker, that this budget will allow us to build all-weather roads to the First Nations and power grids, by the way, because they're still on diesel-generated plants, as part of our strategy. But I will say this, Madam Speaker, before I sit down. The members should know that the decisions that this government will make will come and flow through the budget. So I recommend that he be very patient, like the rest of us, and when the budget comes, it'll lay out exactly what we're attempting to do, and then we'll start to move in the new fiscal year with the major spending commitments. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Resuming debate, the reprise